Welcome to another edition of The Explainer. Today, we're doing things a little bit differently. I want you to think of this not just as a typical overview, but as an essential masterclass on social research ethics. Honestly, consider me your seasoned mentor for the day, here to prepare you for what the field is really like. Because when you step out of the classroom and into actual communities, the stakes are incredibly high. The people you're studying, they aren't just data points. They're complex human beings with real lives, real vulnerabilities, and real secrets. If you're going to build a career in research, you need an ethical foundation that goes way deeper than just basic common sense. So grab your notebooks, get focused.
Usually associate that phrase with doctors and hospitals, right? But it applies just as strictly to us as social researchers. When you're out in the field, you don't have the artificial safety nets of a laboratory. You're observing, sure, but you're also an active participant inside these delicate, real-world social ecosystems. You carry a profound responsibility for the welfare of the people and communities you interact with. Your work absolutely has the power to elevate a community, but if you mishandle it, it can just as easily tear it apart.
Okay, here's our syllabus for the journey ahead. We're going to cover the weight of past mistakes, your ethical philosophy toolkit, mastering trust and consent, navigating risk and harm, and finally, we'll look at ethics in the digital age. We've got a lot of ground to cover, but by the end of this explainer, you're going to have the absolute foundation you need for responsible, ethical scholarship.
Starting with Section 1, the weight of past mistakes and why ethics matter so much. It is absolutely vital to understand that our current ethical rules weren't just dreamed up in a vacuum by a bunch of overly cautious administrators. Not at all. They were written in direct response to devastating historical tragedies and profound human suffering.
Let's look at 1947. Following the absolute horrors of Nazi medical experiments, the Nuremberg Code was established, and that laid the permanent groundwork for voluntary consent and participant welfare. But here is the wild and tragic part. At that exact same time in the United States, the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study was actually running. It started in 1932 and went all the way until it was finally exposed in 1972. For decades, researchers deliberately withheld treatment from African American men just to study how the disease progressed. These horrific precedents established the non-negotiable need for comprehensive ethical frameworks to prevent deception, exploitation, and direct harm. We learn this history so we never, ever repeat it.
Moving on to Section 2, your ethical philosophy toolkit. To be an ethical researcher, you need philosophical lenses. Think of them as a toolkit you use to view the world, make the tough calls, and protect human dignity while you're investigating.
There are three main frameworks you're going to lean on in the field. First up is the Kantian approach. Think of this as the strict rulebook. It demands complete, unwavering respect for human dignity and autonomy. You treat participants as ends in themselves, never, ever just as a means to get your academic paper published. Second is the utilitarian tradition, pushed by thinkers like John Stuart Mill. This is the accountant's ledger. It's all about carefully weighing the potential benefits of your research against the risks, basically aiming to maximize overall well-being and minimize harm. And finally, we have the Foucaultian perspective, or the invisible architect, which forces us to critically analyze power dynamics and how knowledge is actually produced.
And that brings us to a crucial point, understanding your own power. Michel Foucault came up with this concept of biopower, and it serves as a massive warning sign. As a researcher, you have the power to shape narratives. You have to constantly ask yourself if your work is accidentally reinforcing hidden societal hierarchies or inadvertently controlling human life just through the way you're producing knowledge. Seriously, ask yourself, are you actually giving a voice to the marginalized, or are you just reinforcing the very power structures that keep them marginalized in the first place?
All right, Section 3, mastering trust and consent. We're going to step down from the abstract clouds of philosophy and get into the actual dirt of fieldwork. Because out there, trust is literally the fundamental currency of social research. Without trust, you have no access, you get no authenticity, and honestly, your data is totally invalid.
We so often treat informed consent like it's a one-and-done piece of paperwork. You get it signed on day one, shove it in a folder, and get to the good stuff. But we need to talk about process consent. Process consent treats participant agreement as a continuous, living life cycle. It starts with being entirely transparent up front, but then it becomes an ongoing negotiation. You have to regularly check in to ensure they actually still want to participate, and you have to be ready to adapt your procedures if their comfort level shifts. Consent is not just a signature, it's a constant conversation.
And building that level of trust, it requires you to step down off your academic pedestal. Anne Oakley's feminist critique of traditional interviews really hit the nail on the head here. Maintaining strict, cold, emotional distance just doesn't always work. You need a mutual exchange. Look at Philippe Bourgeois and his ethnographic studies of urban poverty. Cultivating trust for him meant making himself vulnerable. You literally have to give back to the communities that are giving you their knowledge. Trust demands reciprocity. It means you have to be willing to strategically share your power with your participants.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, Navigating Risk and Harm. Look, risk assessment isn't just some static checklist you fill out once before leaving campus. It is a highly dynamic, incredibly multifaceted, and ongoing process. Why? Because social contexts are unpredictable and they change all the time.
And remember, risks aren't just physical. Sure, hazardous environments are an obvious threat, but what about psychological risks? Carol Gilligan's groundbreaking research showed us that simply talking through moral dilemmas could trigger really intense, totally unanticipated emotional responses in people. Then you have social, economic, and legal risks. Imagine you're studying undocumented workers or underground economies. A single data breach from your laptop could literally result in your participants losing their jobs, their standing in the community, or even going to prison. You need specific, highly tailored mitigation strategies for every single one of these categories.
Just to show you how messy social and economic risks can actually get, let's look at Elijah Anderson's famous study, Code of the Street. Even though he was super careful with anonymization, changing the names of people, altering the locations, his descriptions were so vivid that people inside the community could still figure out who was who. Publishing your research can create massive social risks for identifiable community members. Sometimes standard anonymization simply isn't enough to protect a community from internal fallout. We also have to talk about harms that don't leave physical bruises. There's dignity harm, which happens when your research diminishes a participant's sense of self-worth or their standing in society. And then there's cultural harm, which is basically misrepresenting or appropriating cultural knowledge. A really tragic example of this is Nancy Shepherd Hughes's book, Saints, Scholars, and Schizophrenics. Her analysis of mental illness in rural Ireland led to this massive, painful community backlash because the locals felt deeply misrepresented and stereotyped. Never forget that your research can cause lasting harm simply through the way a community is portrayed on the page.
So what happens if you mess up? Because it happens. If harm occurs, you don't just pack up your data and run for the hills. You have to lean hard into the principles of restorative justice. You actively acknowledge the harm you caused, you focus entirely on repairing that relationship with the community, you revise your procedures, and you build collaborative partnerships going forward. You are entirely accountable for the wake your research leaves behind.
Finally, Section 5, Ethics in the Digital Age. Pretty much everything we've talked about so far was designed for traditional face-to-face fieldwork. But today, the landscape is shifting under our feet. Big data and AI have completely rewritten the rules of engagement. This is the new, wild frontier for researchers.
I mean, just ask yourself, does traditional informed consent even survive in the age of big data analytics? When a researcher scrapes millions of public posts off social media, none of those users signed a process consent form. None of them explicitly agreed to be part of a massive sociological study. The sheer scale of social media scraping and global data networks challenges absolutely everything we just learned about participant agency and vulnerability.
And this leads us straight into the concept of algorithmic accountability. In traditional fieldwork, you had a direct human relationship with explicit consent. But in algorithmic research, the game changes. Your focus has to shift to data minimization, literally only keeping what is strictly necessary, and managing incredibly complex privacy issues. And honestly, the scariest part is the high risk that automated analysis tools and AI might inadvertently reproduce and amplify existing human biases, creating entirely new forms of harm at a massive automated scale. Today, your ethical literacy has to be just as technical as it is philosophical.
Which leaves us with one final, massive question to reflect on. How are you going to ensure human dignity and unyielding justice when the algorithms take over? Look, technology undeniably scales our ability to gather knowledge, but it equally scales our capacity to do harm. Mastering trust, risk, and harm isn't just about passing a class or getting a degree. It fundamentally defines your character as a researcher. You have a profound moral obligation to take these timeless ethical principles, respect, autonomy, and justice, and adapt them to a rapidly changing, fiercely digital world. Keep questioning, keep reflecting, and always treat your subjects with the ultimate respect they deserve. Thanks so much for joining me for this masterclass on The Explainer.